or the look that he gave me with his one good eye. It was a look of utter, disgusting contempt as he eyed me up and down. Now, I tried to act as if though I'd misheard him in case I really had, so I told him that the soup was coming up, and that's when he starts to rant, saying I'm clearly some sanctimonious rich bitch with my fake-ass boobs. Not that it matters, but, they're not. And how I'm pretty and I know it, and I'm just there to make myself feel better. And then he sees the crucifix around my neck, which was hidden under my sweater, but I guess he somehow saw the imprint of the cross, and starts ranting about how I'm one of those do-gooder Christians who only helps people like him because we want a free pass into heaven. Now, I wasn't about to say anything in my defense to this guy, and I'm not going to explain myself too much here either. All I will say is that in my 25 years on Earth, there have been points where I have gone through certain things that would genuinely horrify you to hear. Parts of my childhood was so bad that I couldn't type about it even if I wanted to. And yes, I did feel good about myself for volunteering at the soup kitchen. Yes, I am a Christian. But is there anything wrong with either of those things? This freaking guy didn't know me, and he didn't have any right to judge me. And I'm sure he'd suffered too, probably terribly from the looks of him, but to assume that I was some privileged B-word who had it easy just because in his opinion I was attractive. How dare he? How absolutely dare he? And so I did what I've always learned to do in these situations. I responded as cheerfully and politely as possible, pretending that I hadn't heard a word he said because in a minute he'd be gone and I'd never have to see him again. I'd take my break and by the time I was done, he'd probably have left. So I poured him his cup of soup and handed it over to him with a big smile, telling him that I hope he enjoyed it and had an absolutely wonderful Thanksgiving. Now, normally this makes people sort of run away feeling stupid, but not him. Oh no. This enraged this guy more than I could possibly have imagined. He took the cup of soup from me and the scalding hot soup and said, "I don't even want it," and called me the C-word and threw the cup of soup in my face. Everyone around him reacted in horror, but I was just frozen, like I'd passed out on my feet. I vaguely remember him running and leaving the building and my face feeling weirdly cold. And the next thing I remember is actually waking up in the hospital. I have a skin condition that, among other things, makes my skin extremely sensitive to high temperatures. The soup had been hot enough to burn away part of my cheek and sent me into shock, which had caused me to pass out and stay unconscious for a few hours. The scalding soup permanently scarred my cheek, and it wasn't bad enough to warrant a skin graft, but there is a red mark there forever that gradually kind of looks like a birthmark. And I also required an operation on my eye, which thankfully was successful, and I retained my sight, but a small section of my right eye is now permanently bloodshot. Belinda had been at the hospital with me. I don't remember this, but apparently all I kept doing was worrying whether they'd close the soup kitchen and that people had been able to get their meals, and she just kept assuring me that no, it was still running. Unfortunately, they were not able to catch the man who assaulted and permanently scarred me. He'd come bursting out that front door and nobody really had known why, and the whole thing had just been so sudden and bizarre. And the chances are, if it had happened to someone who didn't have a sensitive and unpleasant skin condition like mine, it would have just hurt like a mother lover, and that would have been that. Unfortunately, though, not in this case. I spent a few days in the hospital, and the thing that I kept telling myself was, this was just one guy. There are terrible people in every group, and the lesson that I've been taught here, I believe, is that forgiveness isn't necessarily what's important, but rather the lack of placing blame. So I still volunteer at that soup kitchen. I've become friends with some of the regulars, and I wish I could do more to help them. Belinda couldn't believe it, but it just felt right. Now, I'm not some kind of saint, though. There's a part of me, a very dark part hidden deep in the back of my mind, who continues volunteering at that soup kitchen in case that guy returns. And if he does, maybe I'll throw some soup in his face. Most families have Thanksgiving traditions. Some of them are wholesome, some of them are silly, and some of them are just plain bizarre. I know this because I read a Reddit thread about them, and I was going to post my own family tradition and the outcome, but in the end I decided that I didn't want to bring the mood down into the Earth's core. So I thought, hey, why not send it into Let's Read instead? Look, I'm not going to pretend that my dad isn't an idiot. He is. An absolute goofball, and I love him for it. But he'd be the first to admit it. But sometimes his dumb flippery gets him into a bit of hot water. Things like managing to offend a waitress at Red Lobster somehow, or nearly losing a major contract at work for sending a boomer Minions meme to the company that they were courting. Now this idiot is just bad at jokes. He once decided to prank Mom on April Fool's Day for telling her that he'd been cheating on her and wanted a divorce. Only the absolute clown got the date wrong and forgot that March has 31 days in it, and pulled the prank on the morning of March 31st, so Mom had absolutely no reason to suspect it was a joke. And boy, he had a lot of groveling to do after that one. And so you get the point. He's a lovable goofball boomer dad who just isn't funny at all, mostly, but he is indeed lovable. He also caused Thanksgiving to be pretty terrible one year. And so for many years, we had this old serrated electric carving knife for cutting the turkey. It was one of those serrated knives where they're not actually sharp unless you're sawing into something, and on top of that, it was blunted through years of use. And so every year, to entertain the kids, before cutting the turkey, he'd take this damn knife and pretend to cut his hand off with it. It was this whole gimmicky thing. He'd press the blade against his upper wrist, and then wow the little kids with how strong his skin was because he could just press a knife against it. And then for the final shock value, he'd turn the knife on by flicking the switch. Except, it wasn't plugged in, of course, and it wouldn't actually operate. And of course, the rest of the family had to then explain to the little kids that they shouldn't do this, and the knife was blunt, yada yada yada, and it was just some stupid thing Dad always did. And so this one year, the carving knife had finally died, and Mom replaced it with a new one. She told Dad, and she told him multiple times not to do his knife trick this year, and she made him promise, but I guess she didn't explain exactly why. Now here's the problem. Serrated blades can be crazy sharp if they're of a certain design. Electric carving knives these days are famous for being way, way more sharp than people realize. But Dad, in his arrogant wisdom, was still convinced that this wouldn't matter. Besides, it wasn't plugged in. He'd just be careful and make sure that he didn't press it into his skin too much. Of course, this was his explanation after the fact. At the time, none of us knew that he was going to do it. So picture the scene. There's about 15 family members crowded around the table in our large dining room, ready to fill their plates. Dad's about to do the opening ceremony and cut the turkey. And he does it, and he does the trick. He presses the blade against his wrist. Everyone starts to roll their eyes, and then Dad suddenly yells the F word because, even being as careful as possible, the serrated blade cuts right into his wrist. And then the pain causes his other hand to spasm, but it's okay, right, because the carving knife isn't plugged in. Well, no. It's not plugged in because it was a rechargeable knife. So his finger slips, he presses the switch, and we all watch in horror as his brand new, incredibly sharp electric carving knife slices through his wrist like butter. Everyone's screaming, except for Dad, who's just sort of staring down at his severed hand at the blood spraying from it. He's woozy, dizzy with shock, and sort of lifts his arm up, leaving the severed hand behind. And of course, blood sprays everywhere. All over the Thanksgiving dinner spread, all over the family, all over the screaming, crying family members. And I'm the one who springs into action. The knife's still running, embedded into the table now, and I reach through the blood and gore and shut it off. And then I grab my own father's hand and rush him to the kitchen to put it in a bag of ice. Meanwhile, other members of the family are trying to snap my dad out of the shock that he's clearly in. We're calling 911. Others are yelling that the ambulance will take too long, etc. In the end, I drag Dad to my car, throw him into the back seat, place his ice bag hand in the passenger seat, and just hightail it to the emergency room. And I'll never forget it. Dad was unable to say much of anything on the drive there, but he did let out one thing. Thanks for giving me a hand, baby girl. God. If he hadn't been in the back seat with a severely bloody stump of a wrist, I probably would have punched him in the jaw in that moment. Unfortunately, they couldn't save his hand, as there was too much nerve damage that had been caused by the cut, and when my mom arrived at the hospital, she insisted on making up a slightly less embarrassing story of how he severed his hand. I forget the exact details, but I'm sure they didn't buy it. So, Dad only has one hand now. Thankfully, it was his left, and he's right-handed, and that's the thing he always says each year for Thanksgiving now. At least it wasn't my useful hand. And knowing Dad, he wants to say something even more cruder than that. So, that's how my lovable goofball dad effed around and found out, and if anyone asks, he tells them it was bitten off by a shark. He has a prosthetic hand now, and yes, you can best believe that he uses that damn prosthetic hand for boomer dad pranks wherever he can. And the best was last year. My daughter brought her new boyfriend over for Thanksgiving, and they're high school seniors, and her boyfriend is a sweetheart, and Dad introduces himself by walking up behind him, placing his prosthetic hand on the poor kid's lap and saying, "This is what happens to the last guy who got handsy with my granddaughter." Thankfully, me and my daughter had warned him in advance, and the smart-ass kid took the prosthetic hand, turned to face my father, and shook it with a very "pleased to meet you." I think he's a keeper. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams every Sunday and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember to watch your 6, 7.